London in 1640 is often portrayed in modern AI reconstructions as a place of clean lines and quiet dignity, a postcard of gabled roofs and gentle fog, a city that seems almost peaceful. But step into the real London of that year and the illusion collapses instantly. The true city was a suffocating labyrinth of timber and smoke, a restless mass of humanity pressed together in streets no wider than an arm's span. The air was dense with the sour reek of dung, spilled ale, rotting fish, and the stench of the Thames itself, where refuse, animal carcasses, and sometimes bodies drifted slowly past the wharves. Noise never stopped, the sharp cries of hawkers, the clatter of hooves on slippery boards, the brawl of tavern fights, the coughing of the sick behind shuttered windows. Fear haunted every district. Whispers of plague clung to the alleys like a cold mist, and each sudden death, one more boarded house, one more silent doorway, reminded Londoners that survival was never guaranteed. Hunger gnawed at the poor, who stretched mold-flecked bread and prayed for rain to wash the filth away. Meanwhile, the city simmered with political fury. King and Parliament locked in a confrontation that threatened to tear the realm apart, and every sermon, every tavern argument, every cheaply printed pamphlet felt like a spark drifting toward a powder keg. Beauty existed, but only as a thin skin stretched over a world of squalor, fear, and tension. AI images show elegance. Reality was endurance. Londoners lived with the constant sense that something terrible was approaching, war, plague, fire, or judgment, and moved through their days like people balancing on a crumbling ledge. If you found yourself there, even for a moment, one breath of that choking air would tell you the truth. This was not a city of calm history, but a city fighting, every hour, simply to stay alive. The first sight that greeted anyone crossing into London in 1640 was not the elegance of a thriving capital, but the grim spectacle of death displayed as public warning. At the southern gate of London Bridge, severed heads of executed traitors were mounted on iron spikes, their skin darkened by wind and rot, their hair tangled by the damp river air. Some had been there for months, and their faces, gnawed by crows, hollowed by decay, stared silently at every traveler who dared step into the city. Beneath them, the bridge itself heaved with noise and fear, merchants shouting over the clatter of carts, children darting through the crowds, and armed guards patrolling with a watchful tension that hinted at the city's political instability. Beyond the bridge rose the Tower of London, its stone walls looming like a fortress built from shadows. The tower was not just a landmark. It was the iron heart of royal authority, the place where whispers of treason ended in chains. Inside its cold halls, prisoners waited in dread, never knowing whether they would face interrogation, execution, or a quiet death in a forgotten cell. Rumors spread constantly of confessions carved out by torture, of nobles disappearing into dungeons, of enemies of the crown forced to watch the preparations for their own beheading. Londoners lived with the tower in their minds like a constant threat, visible from the river, visible from the streets, visible from the nightmares of those who questioned the king. Every bell that rang from its battlements seemed to carry an unspoken warning. Justice in 1640 London was swift, brutal, and deeply public. Executions drew crowds eager for spectacle, their cheers mingling with the screams of the condemned. Heads on spikes reminded the living that dissent had a price, and the tower itself stood as an immovable symbol of power, cold, watchful, and ready to consume anyone who stepped out of line. London in 1640 was a city where filth was not an inconvenience, but a defining element of daily life, a living force that shaped every breath, every step, every moment of existence. The streets were narrow trenches of mud and human waste, slick with the runoff of chamber pots emptied from upper windows at dawn and dusk, the liquid splashing onto stones already thick with dung, dead animals, and the refuse of thousands who had no other place to dispose of anything. The smell struck visitors like a physical blow, a choking blend of rot, smoke, urine, spoiled fish, and the sour stench rising from the Thames, which carried more sewage than water. People walked with their cloaks drawn tight and their heads low, trying to avoid the streams of filth that trickled through the alleys, but the odor clung to everything: clothes, skin, hair, even dreams. Rats thrived in this environment, swarming through markets and burrowing beneath houses, fattening on the city's endless supply of garbage. They were so numerous that their rustling became part of the city's background noise, like bells or street vendors. In wealthier districts, servants rushed out each morning to scatter herbs or burn scented resins, desperate to disguise the stench, but the effort only mixed sweetness with decay, creating a sickly perfume that lingered in doorways. Water was no refuge, either. Wells were often contaminated, and the Thames, a dark ribbon of sludge, was used for washing, dumping waste, and sometimes even drinking when no other option remained. Illness spread easily in this world of perpetual filth. Fevers, stomach sickness, and skin infections were common companions, and every Londoner knew that one unlucky mouthful of contaminated food or water could turn an ordinary day into a descent toward death. Cleanliness was a luxury almost no one could afford, and in the suffocating grime of the city, survival itself felt like a daily act of defiance against an environment designed to consume the weak. In 1640, the fear of plague hung over London like a permanent shadow, a quiet but relentless presence that shaped every heartbeat of the city. Even in years when the mortality rolls seemed calmer, Londoners lived with the certainty that the disease never truly left. It merely slept, waiting for the right season or the right victim to awaken it again. The first signs were always whispered: a family suddenly shuttering their windows, a neighbor vanishing from the market, a cart arriving at night with no lanterns lit. Rumors spread faster than the illness itself, stories of swelling buboes the size of fists, of blackened skin mottled with purple patches, of fever so violent it drove victims into delirium. When plague appeared in a household, officials marked the door with a crude red symbol, boarded up the windows, and posted a watchman outside to ensure no one escaped. Inside, the infected lay in darkness, breathing in the rot of their own failing bodies, hearing the muffled sounds of the city continuing without them. Many died alone, without priest or comfort, their final moments witnessed only by the rats that crawled across the floorboards. At night, the death carts rolled through the streets, their drivers calling out, "Bring out your dead," a phrase that chilled even the bravest souls. Bodies were wrapped in sheets and thrown onto the wagon without ceremony, stacked in layers until the cart groaned under the weight. Graveyards overflowed, and hastily dug pits became communal resting places for dozens at a time. The plague did not simply kill, it isolated, humiliated, and terrified. People avoided each other, avoided touch, avoided breath itself. Every cough became a threat, every stranger a danger. London lived with the knowledge that the disease could reappear at any moment, transforming ordinary days into scenes of panic and despair, and reminding the city how fragile life truly was. By 1640, London's streets belonged as much to criminals as to honest citizens, for when darkness fell, the city transformed into a hunting ground where the law held little power and survival depended on caution, instinct, and luck. Without a formal police force, London was policed only by the dim glow of lanterns and the occasional night watchman, a handful of poorly paid men who patrolled with more fear than authority. Thieves moved through the alleys like shadows, cut purses who slipped hands into pockets with impossible delicacy, footpads who lurked behind taverns waiting to strike travelers over the head with clubs, and gangs of young boys who worked in packs, distracting victims with chatter while nimble fingers relieved them of coin and belongings. These urchins of the night were often no older than 10, abandoned or orphaned, hardened by hunger and the brutal indifference of the city. In the rookeries, the labyrinthine slums where the poorest lived, crime wasn't a profession, but a lifeline. The alleys twisted so tightly that even moonlight struggled to enter, creating a world of narrow passages where strangers vanished without a trace. The sound of footsteps behind you could mean robbery, or worse. Many thieves carried blades, and the line between theft and murder blurred in the frenzy of desperation. Taverns became nests for criminal alliances, with drunken brawls erupting into knife fights as quickly as spilled ale hit the floor. Women in these districts risked assault simply by walking alone, and traveling after dusk was considered an act of reckless courage. Even the river offered no safety. Smugglers prowled the docks, and bodies sometimes floated in with the tide after violent disputes. For Londoners living through this chaos, Nighttime was not a pause from the dangers of the day, but an escalation of them, a time when the city revealed its darkest instincts, and every shadow whispered the same warning: trust no one and keep moving if you want to see the dawn. Southwark in 1640 was the beating, lawless heart of London's darkest appetites, a district where the thin veil of civility slipped away the moment the sun set and the crowds began to gather. Separated from the main city by the Thames and largely ignored by authorities, it became a sanctuary for every indulgence respectable London pretended not to crave. Taverns spilled their drunken patrons into the streets, their windows glowing with firelight as the sounds of shouting, laughter, and breaking glass poured out into the night. The air was thick with the smell of spilled ale, sweat, and smoke, mingling with the river's rot to create a haze that clung to clothing and skin. Prostitutes called from doorways, painted in bold, their voices echoing through narrow lanes where shadows hid both pleasure and danger. Brothels operated openly, some luxurious, others squalid makeshift rooms where desperation and desire met in anonymity. Gambling dens thrived in back alleys, where dice clattered across warped wooden tables and fortunes changed hands under flickering candles. Southwark was also home to brutal entertainments. Bear-baiting pits roared with bloodthirsty crowds, torches blazing as chained bears fought snarling dogs, each strike cheered with animal fury. Nearby, the Globe Theatre drew crowds hungry not just for art, but for spectacle. Fights, pranks, drunken brawls, and sudden robberies were as common as performances. The streets teemed with pickpockets, hustlers, and petty criminals who prowled among the revelers, preying on anyone too drunk or too distracted to guard their purse. Yet amid all this chaos, Southwark pulsed with a strange vitality, the music of lutes drifting from alehouses, the rhythmic clatter of boots on wet cobblestone, the glow of lanterns reflected in puddles, the laughter of those who sought escape from the harshness of the wider city. It was a place where London came to lose itself, to drown fear in sensation, to indulge in sin without apology, and to confront the wild, unrestrained heart beating beneath its own skin. By 1640, London had become a battlefield of clashing beliefs, its streets filled not only with the noise of commerce and survival, but with the feverish roar of religious conviction. The city simmered with spiritual anxiety, the fear that plague, famine, and political chaos were not random events, but divine warnings. Everywhere, preachers appeared like omens, on street corners, in marketplaces, outside taverns, thundering sermons of judgment and repentance to crowds that gathered half out of faith and half out of fear. Some wore ragged robes and carried wooden crosses. Others claimed visions or dreams in which God revealed the city's impending doom. Sects proliferated like wildfire. Puritans denounced the decadence of London, calling for strict moral reform, while more radical groups, the Fifth Monarchists, the Seekers, the Ranters, whispered prophecies of the world's collapse and the rise of a new divine kingdom. These sects argued loudly in alleys and churchyards, their members inflamed by both desperation and hope, convinced that Scripture held coded messages for those willing to see. Pamphlets containing half-mad predictions flooded the streets, sold for pennies, their pages filled with dire warnings, comet sightings, unusual storms, political unrest, all signs, they claimed, of God's approaching wrath. Ordinary people, already exhausted by disease and hunger, clung to these prophecies as explanations for the chaos around them. Some prayed fervently in candlelit rooms, trembling as though the angel of death waited outside their door. Others joined mobs that smashed church windows or confronted clergy accused of corruption. Even the sound of church bells carried a haunting double meaning, a call to worship and a reminder that judgment could fall at any moment. London was a city living on the edge of spiritual panic, where every cough, every rumor, every flicker of lightning might be interpreted as a message from heaven. Faith, paranoia, and desperation merged until it became impossible to tell where religion ended and fear began. By 1640, poverty had become one of the most visible and brutal forces shaping daily life in London, cutting across every district like an open wound. Nearly half the city's population lived on the brink of starvation, trapped in a cycle of scarcity that no charity, church, or government decree could truly break. Families crowded into single damp rooms where the walls wept with moisture and the floorboards sagged under the weight of too many feet. Children scavenged through refuse heaps in search of anything edible, fighting off rats that were often better fed than they were. Bread, once the simplest staple, became a rare luxury for the poor. Loaves were so small and so expensive that families sometimes mixed ground bones or sawdust into their meals to stretch them further. In markets, spoiled fish and wilted vegetables were sold at discounted prices to desperate buyers who preferred illness to hunger. Soup kitchens, run by parishes, overflowed with gaunt bodies, and even then, the thin broth they offered barely sustained life. Clothes hung from starving frames like rags on broken mannequins, patched and repatched until the fabric simply dissolved. The smell of hunger was everywhere, a faint sour scent of weakness that clung to entire neighborhoods. The social order strained under this pressure. Beggars lined bridges and church doors, some blind, some crippled, some pretending to be both to earn a few pennies. Theft increased, not out of malice, but necessity, as parents stole to feed their children and children stole to feed themselves. Riots occasionally erupted when grain supplies ran low or prices rose too quickly, leading to clashes with guards who were just as hungry and embittered. Poverty did not merely starve the body, it poisoned the spirit, eroding hope and turning survival into a daily contest against despair. Hunger was the quiet tyrant of London, a force as dangerous as plague or war, always watching, always tightening its grip. By 1640, London stood at the center of a political storm that threatened to tear England apart, a tension so sharp it could be felt in the very air, in the way people spoke, argued, prayed, and feared. King Charles III, convinced of his divine right to rule, clashed violently with a parliament determined to limit his power, and the city became the battleground for their escalating conflict. Every tavern, church, and marketplace buzzed with whispered rumors that the king planned to arrest members of parliament, that parliament plotted to seize control of the army, that foreign Catholic powers waited to strike. Pamphlets flooded the streets like falling leaves, printed cheaply and in secret, each one filled with accusations, conspiracies, demands for justice, or calls for rebellion. Londoners devoured them, passing pages hand to hand until the ink smudged across their fingers. Speakers stood on barrels in public squares, shouting about tyranny or treason, drawing crowds that roared with anger or trembled with uncertainty. Loyalists and parliamentarians clashed in fistfights, arguments boiling into violence, neighbors turning on each other over political loyalties. Soldiers marched through the streets with tense expressions, unsure which side they themselves would ultimately serve. The fear of civil war seeped into daily life. Fathers worried their sons would be conscripted, merchants feared blockades, and families hoarded food in case the city was besieged. Even the great buildings of London seemed to lean under the growing weight of unrest. Westminster, filled with heated debate, its halls echoing with speeches that could ignite a nation. St. Paul's thrummed with whispered prayers for peace or victory. The Tower loomed as a silent threat, ready to imprison whichever side lost. London was a city sitting atop a powder keg, every spark of rumor or anger capable of setting the entire realm ablaze, and everyone felt that an irreversible break was coming, soon and violently. By 1640, London stood on the threshold of a transformation so vast and violent that no one living in the city could have imagined it. The streets pulsed with unrest, the air heavy with smoke, fear, and expectation, as though the city itself sensed that history was coiling around it like a tightening rope. Daily life continued. Merchants shouted prices, children chased each other through filthy alleys, church bells marked the hours. But beneath this surface, familiarity lay a growing sense of imbalance. Plague whispered in the corners, hunger gnawed at families, political rage split the population, and crime thrived in every shadow. It felt as if the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Buildings leaned dangerously over streets far too narrow for the swelling crowds, their timber frames dried by decades of hearth fires, turning entire districts into tinderboxes without anyone realizing it. Candle flames licked at curtains, ovens glowed in overcrowded kitchens, and wooden rooftops sat packed shoulder to shoulder like a forest of kindling. The great monuments, St. Paul's, Westminster, the Tower, cast long shadows, silent guardians unable to protect the city from what was coming. Even the Thames seemed to reflect a strange unease, its dark waters carrying refuse, bodies, and the weight of the city's sins toward the sea. Londoners felt change in their bones, but could not name it. They sensed danger, but did not know its shape. They feared plague, revolt, invasion, never suspecting that fire, not politics or disease, would one day sweep through these streets and erase centuries of life in a single inferno. Yet in 1640, the fire was still only an idea, a ghost hiding in ovens and hearths, waiting for its moment. London continued to live, fight, pray, and suffer, unaware that it was already walking toward a catastrophe that would forever reshape its identity, burning away the past to forge the modern city that would rise from the ashes.